Okay, calm down.
I'm going to introduce the first two guests that we're bringing on. And those two guests are Layla Saliba, who is a Palestinian American graduate student at Columbia University. She's studying social work with a concentration in policy practice. And Prem Thakker is a politics reporter at the Intercept and is a former reporter at the New Republic. His work has also appeared in the American Prospect, Washington Monthly, CNN podcasts, and his newsletter, Better World. So, welcome to the show, Layla and Prem. Hi, guys. Thanks for joining.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having us.
Of course.
Hey, thank you so much for having us.
Of course. Layla, we're going to start with you. Tell us what happened to you. Was it not this past Friday, but the Friday before that?
I was at the protest. I was actually one of the students who got sprayed with a skunk. I'm a student at Columbia University. And so what we were doing is we were protesting for what's called divestment. And so divestment basically means that the tuition, the money that we're spending towards Columbia, we don't want it to go towards military weapons manufacturers. We don't want it to go towards defense contractors, et cetera. So that's why we were protesting. We didn't want our tuition money to be used in that way. And a lot of these companies, they support, was it the occupation and the destruction of what's going on to the Palestinian people in Gaza. And I went to the march personally. So I've lost family in Gaza. I'm Palestinian American. And this is something that's really personal for me. I went because I wanted to stand up for the humanitarian rights of the Palestinian people. It's something that's often been ignored or neglected. Being Palestinian these days, like when you're watching the media, it's like you often don't feel human because the way that people look at it is like when people see this stuff, they see just like numbers, but they don't see that like we are actual human beings with stories and family members and people who love us. And that's really why I went. And what happened, it was honestly like when I think about it, it's still surreal. Like it sounds almost like something out of a Law and Order episode or something like science fiction. So while we were at the protest, we were all marching, and there were these two students, and they were being very hostile and very aggressive towards us. And I went and took pictures of them because I was like, something is off here. The way that they were coming up to us and interacting with us, they were referring to students as terrorists, as Jew killers, especially if you can see right there in the photo. So that's one of my friends, and she was holding up a banner that said, "See you Jews for ceasefire." She's part of
Columbia
Jewish Voice.
University for ceasefire.
Yes, Columbia
Right.
University, Jews for Ceasefire. She's part of Jewish Voices for Peace. And so
Nice.
she was holding up this banner, and these two individuals were being really disrespectful towards her.
These
They
two
were,
guys, so you're talking about, Brad, can we zoom in there? So the
yes.
people you're alleging were responsible is the guy in the red jacket and the guy with the
Hmm.
green hat, which has a Jewish star on it,
Yes.
by the way. Okay.
Both
Okay.
of these individuals have experience with the Israeli occupation forces. So what that means is they both have military service.
So that's what other people will call, and Israel will call, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, but obviously
Mhm.
people will call it the Israeli Occupation Forces for obvious reasons.
It was very surreal when it happened because we were all marching and then we all smelt this horrible smell. I remember thinking, I was like, oh my gosh, it smells like somebody just died. Like what is going on here? But we couldn't really see it at the time because during the protest it was snowing like crazy. So it was really hard to determine that there was any kind of like spray or mist going on at first. All we noticed was this horrible smell. And so as this as the smell continued, we realized that these students, we realized that they came up and tried to like interact with me. So they came up and tried to, what was it? They referred to me as a terrorist, which, which is not a great experience, but unfortunately common being Palestinian right now. So they did that. And then also it was just like, it was really challenging because these individuals They seemed like they were very uncomfortable being photographed and they wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. The reason why I took pictures is because typically when it comes to a protest on campus, it's usually like the same 10 or 20 people. I tend to recognize them, but I didn't recognize these guys, which is why I took the photos of them. And we didn't realize until a few hours after the protest what exactly had happened. At the time, I thought, oh, maybe it's just like a bad smell, like maybe I stepped on some dog poop. Like I didn't really realize what was going on, but I noticed how horrible I felt afterwards. I was nauseous. My clothes smelled awful. Like to this day, my clothes still smell like sewage. And we quickly realized we're like someone did this to us, like this was intentional. I was getting calls and texts from my friends out of nowhere being like, oh my gosh, I feel horrible, oh my gosh, I'm throwing up, like what is wrong? And it all happened after the protest and we all had this smell. And so the reason how we recognize that it was skunk is because skunk is used on Palestinians in the West Bank. And so skunk is it's a type of chemical weapon. And skunk, it sticks to your hair and your skin and your clothing. The only way you can get it out is a special soap that's only sold to law enforcement. So you cannot go just like buy this stuff on Amazon if or like the member of the general public, like you cannot get access to this stuff. You have to have a law enforcement or military background in order to have access to this stuff, which is scary. And then also too is like part of how we figured out it wasn't say like pepper spray, because I've had pepper spray used on me before. A was just how severe the side effects were and how much the stench stunk to our clothing. Like people were using all kinds of stuff to try and getting the smell out. We thought maybe it was just a skunk spray from an animal at first, so people were suggesting like tomato juice. But we tried tomato juice, vinegar, hydrogen peroxide, all kinds of stuff, and we couldn't get the smell out. And the way that the university acted was pretty negligent, in my opinion, just because it wasn't until our article with the Intercept came out that they even decided to do something.
So, Prem, tell us about how you even encountered this story and decided to look into it.
I mean, one thing that's notable, and I think Layla has touched on it and probably will talk about further, is just that this was something that the impacted students were not making secret. They were, trying to make as much noise as they could on social media. And of course, one aspect of this broader story is that it just wasn't being written about. To this day, nary that many members of Congress have really spoken on this. I believe Congressman Jamal Bowman has, perhaps a few others, some local officials have as well, but it just wasn't garnering that much attention. And it was something that, by the time I was getting ready for the weekend and stories to work on, I was thinking about this over the weekend. And so, for a bit of timeline here, this rally had happened on Friday, and it was not acknowledged by the university in any particular way until late Sunday night when the Department of Public Safety sent out a notice and an email discussing how they were aware of this troubling incident. They were working with authorities, but it didn't get into too much other specifics. Monday morning, the provost sent an email regarding campus policies, such as reminding students not to cause bodily harm. They reiterated protest policies, but in some ways was even more vague than the previous email because it didn't necessarily say this was in response to an incident that had occurred, 3 days prior. And then the first sort of more specific comments the university issued was in response to questions that we sent out to them as we were working on the story. And that is when we received the statement that I think maybe got some deal of attention, is when, in response to questions I had about, the university response to this incident and about concerns about students such as, Layla feeling unsafe on campus, a spokesperson had told us that Friday's event was, quote, unsanctioned and violated university policies and procedures which are in place to ensure there's adequate personnel on the ground to keep our community safe. So it kind of just dismissed some of the, basic premises of the
And
question.
victim blame, too.
Yeah, that is
Yeah,
certainly
definitely.
one way of reading it, and it was definitely particularly interesting because that was the first real time that the university was speaking to exactly what had happened. So an hour or so after we published, the university sent a subsequent email, I believe through the provost's office, in much more specific fashion, saying that they were working with authorities to investigate possible hate crime, and saying that the alleged perpetrators were banned. And something that again, I'm sure Layla might get into, and other students have reported, is that it's not clear if these students are actually banned. They've been seen on campus.
Yeah.
Columbia itself is an open campus, so like to the university's, credit, it is a little difficult to do that. But
Mhm.
if a university is to say that individuals are banned from campus, um, you'd expect some form of concrete steps to make that happen, and it's not clear what exactly those steps are at the moment. That's something I'm still looking into personally. Um, and of course, another thorny part about this is that as this investigation is ongoing now, and it's handed off to different authorities, it's still not confirmed that the perpetrators who students believe are the perpetrators are indeed the perpetrators. So it's even harder then
Exactly.
to then say, like, is this ban being enforced? Is it not being enforced? Because you don't even know who exactly is
Mhm.
banned. So the response thus far has been a bit slow, and then B, just,
Mhm.
you know, unusual insofar as with an incident like this, regardless of who is potentially implicated, it is concerning. And you'd imagine that, especially for students who feel, unsafe, traumatized, or what have you, on their own campus, that they'd expect some level of certainty, and that hasn't been provided really up to this point.
I just want
Mhm,
to show the comment that you received, Prem, when you asked from on behalf of the Intercept for a statement.
mhm.
This is how they responded to your question about hazardous chemical being sprayed. Friday's event was unsanctioned and violated university policies and procedures, which are in place to ensure there is adequate personnel on the ground to keep our community safe. Just imagine if there had been a pro Israel rally that was spontaneous and didn't have um, official sanction, and then those kids said that they had felt unsafe.
Yeah.
Imagine in a million years a university saying, well, it was unsanctioned. So there you go.
Exactly. Or like, what if an Arab or a Muslim student did this? Like, there are
Yes.
no congressional hearings. Bill Ackman, as much as he's talked about higher education lately, he hasn't said a word. Um, Joe Biden has said nothing. It's really they're trying to sweep this under the rug as much as possible. There hasn't even been a university wide email sent out or a Clary alert sent out too, which they're supposed to do with all crimes. But like I've been talking to people about it on campus and telling my professors about it, and like they don't know what's going on, which is really concerning, especially seeing as over 15 students have had to go to the hospital for medical attention.
Another aspect of this that I think is important is that, of course, we're very lucky to have a lot of first person testimony in this story, of course, Layla included, but everything from exactly what substance they were exposed to again exactly who the perpetrators are is something that these students are having to piece together themselves, and
Mm-hmm.
is something that both you'd expect both on the university level as well as perhaps on the city level, and of course just on a congressional level. These are questions that you would naturally want to ask.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, if the chemical, for example, was indeed skunk or some version of it. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz once wrote on this chemical, a few years back, that, quote, skunk is, let me pull this up, skunk is liable to cause physical harm, such as intense nausea, vomiting, and skin rashes, in addition to any injury resulting from the powerful force of the spray. And they also wrote that examinations by police and army medical teams in the past also indicated that the excessive coughing caused by exposure can result in suffocation. So on one hand, we already have, these medical reports, this testimony, and,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, a paper trail of these students going to different hospitals and care centers, exhibiting concerning symptoms. On the other, and concurrently, we have um, sort of ongoing proof of what a potential chemical like this can cause to people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and these are questions you'd imagine that, anyone with authority would want to jump onto, and sort of draw a line to say that, no student, no young person, whether they have, whether they're Palestinian, Israeli, Arab, Muslim, Jewish, what have you, wherever they are, no young person in this country should be, facing this kind of thing. And it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
seem thus far that that standard is being upheld. To your point, of course, imagining the sort of counterfactuals, and of course, we don't necessarily have to think of counterfactuals because, of course, we're we're looking back to a previous hearing that was held about concerns
Hmm.
about anti-Semitism on campus, which of course, are important. But when we have a clear instance like this happening, you'd imagine that there would be at least some level of analogous attention. And thus far, again, as far as members of Congress, Jamal Bowman, I might have missed a few other, but not many other members of Congress have said anything about this yet.
And Jewish students were attacked too. It's like
Exactly. Yes.
yeah, if we're talking about
Right.
anti-Semitism on
Of course.
campus,
Right.
multiple Jewish
But they
students
don't
had to go
count.
to the hospital. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't count if we're not pro-Israel. And Prem, can you put this in the context? Because you have an article that you wrote about the increased crackdown on sit-ins and protests. Can you set this up? Give us the context that you wrote about in your piece.
The broader context of this is that, as we've seen, there have been students all over the country at different universities and schools and colleges, sort of protesting broadly in support of the people in Gaza. They've been protesting against perhaps their university investment policies, calling on the universities to divest from companies implicated in Israel's occupation or the ongoing war in Gaza, or if nothing else, just for financial transparency, so they know whether the university they attend and pay money to is invested in these companies. And so a handful of colleges that we looked at, they have been host to sit-in protests. Of course, a sort of marker of the civil rights legacy in this country, something that, especially in wake of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, is something that many people have reflected on. But many of these universities have really cracked down on that kind of protest. At Brown, at University of Michigan, Amherst, U Chicago, and others as well. But those were some universities that we focused on, in which at these schools, of course, they had policies in place that, for instance, might limit how many students can gather in a place, or for how long they can do so, or how loud they can be. But many of these rules were not really enforced in the past, or being enforced in a way that seems sort of just dramatically at a higher degree than in previous instances. And of course, one way of thinking about this is, at how many of these schools, a lot of kids get really rowdy after, perhaps a huge football game, or, some really exciting sporting event where, kids get maybe a little too crazy, and maybe even, burn some furniture, whatever, things that on paper are perhaps and very likely university violations, but probably wouldn't get the sort of response we're seeing here at these universities. So for instance, at Amherst, there was dozens of students that received probation and received campus disciplinary hearings and so on, to the point that a few students were actually barred from studying abroad. And at Michigan, there's another sit-in protest where even before the protest had begun, dozens of police vehicles had showed up to where the protesters were or were going to be. And these officers and their vehicles came from at least 9 different police jurisdictions. Some of these vehicles and officers had riot shields, and this was before the sit-in began. So there's sort of this presumption of escalation that is implied, and in the same way that this is not unfamiliar to a lot of protests that we've seen over the past 4 years in this country, but particularly with regards to students who, by and large, these are sit-in protests, particularly with regards to this article, but largely speaking, many of these protests, if not all, are largely peaceful. They might be disruptive, of course, because that's where it gets into campus policy. And again, things are on paper, perhaps they violate policies, but they might be disruptive, but they're largely peaceful. There's no sort of necessity to think that they will require riot shields in response. But at all of these universities, it seems to be just this much more severe response to students who, again, at many of these universities as well, these sit-ins have only come after weeks and weeks of previous protesting. And again, many times these demands are, if not for the university to divest, at least to have a public meeting, to have public transparency about their investments. And so these were escalatory actions. They weren't sort of just inflammatory ways to just, from my perception, just cause a racket for no reason. I think they were in response to silence from these administrators.
That's
so at
exactly what it is.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. Like, at least at Columbia, it's been so difficult to get in touch with members of administration. Like we've tried calling, we've tried emailing, they ignore us. Um, they monitor our social media posts, which is bizarre. But a lot of information just isn't public. Like when it comes to, like, say, the board of trustees. So I went to a state school for undergrad. I went to NC State, and so our board of trustees, because it was a public university, you could figure out when are they going to meet, what are they talking about. You could have their email addresses, all that stuff. And it's like at Columbia, we don't get that transparency. Everything is in the dark. And I think students are really frustrated because they're like, my tuition dollars are going towards a cause that I don't agree with, and I can't have any say in it. So it's understandable that students are continuing to escalate.
Prem, before you leave, because I know you have a time restraint, anything you want to talk about that you're working on related to Palestine? Because it's just from your Twitter account and also your work at the Intercept, you have even more recent pieces relating to Palestine. Anything you want to preview for us?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I'm still focused on Colombia's response to what's going on, or perhaps lack thereof. If anyone happens to know anything going on there, or happens to work within the university and wants to share anything with me, you can email me, or um, DM me on Twitter for my signal. I surely will, as I always do, protect my sources. That's very important to me. I don't want anyone to face any consequence for speaking out. Just as well, more broadly, um, I think this is, as you've seen, especially at the Intercept, this is a broad issue that we are very focused on in terms of repression, in terms of also just policy making. So, of course, I am very concerned with the university aspect of this, but also, of course, with how our administration and government is navigating this. So, as always, go to the Intercept to read, but also if you know of any knowledge, to please feel free to message us. I guess one other aspect, and I think I saw this in the comments, I am also focused on East Palestine in Ohio. It is about to be the 1 year anniversary of that awful derailment. And so you can look forward to more coverage on that as well. But generally, just thank you all for who have read us. And please do continue to follow. We're trying our best, and we'll keep working hard.
And you just wrote a story about how the UAW endorsed Biden despite demanding a ceasefire, which he obviously is avoiding.
Indeed. Yes, yes, yes. Definitely focused on the labor aspect as well. Always concerned with labor broadly, but especially as more and more unions, and union members continue to call for a ceasefire. That's another intersection where we're very interested in.
And I want to share something. You don't have to stay because I know you have to go, but who
That's
did
all
you
right.
write this up yourself? This very useful since the ICJ hearing tweet?
That's me.
So this is something I think is worth reading because
Yeah.
it drives home what we're talking about. Layla, you know this obviously more
Mhm.
than most people because you've lost family in this
Mhm.
genocide. But just so people get what's at stake when we're talking about protesting and what people like Layla are protesting and then getting sprayed with hazardous chemicals about, since the ICJ ruling, right? Um, you're right. Since the International Court of Justice ruled 4 days ago that Israel is plausibly committing genocide, Israeli forces have reportedly killed 668 Palestinians and injured 1,149. Nancy
Mhm.
Pelosi suggests that groups calling for a ceasefire are Russian agents, says FBI should investigate. US, Germany, Japan, Canada, France, Switzerland, Netherlands, UK, Italy, Australia, Austria, Finland, Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Iceland, New Zealand, and Sweden suspend funding to UNRWA, which we talked about in our last episode with Craig McIver, which is an absolute outrage. And if you think you
Mhm.
couldn't find 12 members of the IDF who have committed crimes, you're in serious denial. And if you're consistent, you should then call for the defunding of the IDF. Okay. Hundreds of settlers host a conference headlined by officials, including National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, calling for the settlement of Gaza. Israeli forces infiltrate a hospital dressed as medical staff in order to execute 3 Palestinians in the West Bank, not Gaza. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant says Israel will maintain military control of the Gaza Strip once the conflict is over, giving it freedom to operate similarly to the way it currently does in the West Bank. People in Israel repeatedly block aid trucks from entering Gaza, where
Mhm.
hundreds of thousands of people, including the hostages, are at risk of starvation and malnutrition. Israeli forces heighten attacks around multiple hospitals, Palestinians seen being detained blindfolded and left barefoot by Israeli forces in southern Gaza. So that really drives home what
Yeah.
is at stake.